What is poetry? In this video, I'm going to talk about the elements of poetry. Prosody. Prosody is the study of the meter, rhythm, and intonation of a poem. Rhythm and meter are different, although closely related. Meter is a definitive pattern established for the verse, such as iambic pentameter, while rhythm is the actual sound that results from a line of poetry. Prosody also may be used more specifically to refer to the scanning of poetic lines to show meter. Rhythm. The methods for creating poetic rhythm vary across languages and between poetic traditions. Languages are often described as having timing set primarily by accent syllables or moras, depending on how rhythm is established. Though a language can be influenced by multiple approaches, Japanese is a mora-timed language. Latin, Catalan, French, Leonese, Galician, and Spanish are called syllable-timed languages. Stress-timed languages include English, Russian, and generally German. Varying intonation also affects how rhythm is perceived. Languages can rely on either pitch or tone. Some languages with a pitch accent are Vedic, Sanskrit, or Ancient Greek. Tonal languages include Chinese, Vietnamese, and most sub-Saharan languages. Metrical rhythm generally involves precise arrangements of stresses or syllables into repeated patterns called feet within a line. In modern English, verse, the pattern of stresses primarily differentiate feet, so rhythm based on meter in modern English is most often found on the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables alone or elided. In the classical languages, on the other hand, while the metrical units are similar, vowel length rather than stresses define the meter. Old English poetry used a metrical pattern involving varied numbers of syllables but a fixed number of strong stresses in each line. The chief device of ancient Hebrew biblical poetry, including many of the Psalms, were parallelism, rhetorical structure in which successive lines reflected each other in grammatical structure, sound structure, notional content, or all three. Parallelism lent itself to antiphonal or column response performance, which can also be reinforced by intonation. Thus, biblical poetry relies much less on metrical feet to create rhythm, but instead creates rhythm based on much larger sound units of lines, phrases, and sentences. Some classical poetry forms, such as the Vempa or the Tamil language, had rigid grammars to the point that they could be expressed as context-free grammar, which ensured a rhythm. Classical Chinese poetics, based on the tone system of Middle Chinese, recognized two kinds of tones, the level ping tone and the oblique zhe tones, a category consisting of the rising shang tone, the departing q tone, and entering ru tone. Certain forms of poetry placed constraints on which syllables were required to be level and which oblique. The formal patterns of meter used in modern English verse to create rhythm no longer dominate contemporary English poetry. In the case of free verse, rhythm is often organized based on looser units of cadence rather than regular meter. Robinson Jeffers, Marianne Moore, and William Carlos Williams are three notable poets who reject the idea that regular essential meter is critical to English poetry. Jeffers experimented with sprung rhythm as an alternative to accentual rhythm. Meter. In the Western poetic tradition, meters are customarily grouped according to a characteristic metrical foot and the number of feet per line. The number of metrical feet in a line are described using Greek terminology: tetrameter for 4 feet and hexameter for 6 feet. For example, thus, iambic pentameter is a meter comprising 5 feet per line, in which the predominant kind of foot is the iamb. This metric system originated in ancient Greek poetry and was used by poets such as Pindar, Sappho, and by great tragedians of Athens. Similarly, dactylic hexameter comprises 6 feet per line, of which the dominant kind is a dactyl. Dactylic hexameter was the traditional meter of Greek epic poetry, the earliest examples of which are the works of Homer and Hesiod. Iambic pentameter and dicactic hexameter were later used by a number of poets, including William Shakespeare and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, respectively. The most common metrical feet in English are iamb, one stressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, describe, include, retract, trochee, one stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable, picture, flower, dactyl, one stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables, annotate, similar, anapace, 2 unstressed syllables followed by 1 stressed syllable, comprehend, spundy, 2 stressed syllables together, heartbeat, 14, periodic, 2 unstressed syllables together, rare, usually used to end dactylic hexameter. There are a wide range of names for other types of feet, right up to the Sherome, a 4-syllable metric foot with stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables and closing with a stressed syllable. The Sherome is derived from some ancient Greek and Latin poetry, languages which utilize vowel length or intonation rather than or in addition to syllabic accents in determining meter, such as Ottoman Turkish or Vedic, often have concepts similar to the iamb or the dactyl to describe common combinations of long or short sounds. Each of these types of feet has a certain feel, whether alone or in combination with other feet. The iamb, for example, is the most natural form of rhythm in the English language and generally produces subtle but stable verse. Scanning meter can often show the basic fundamental pattern underlying a verse, but does not show the varying degrees of stress, as well as the differing pitches and lengths of syllables. There is debate over how useful a multiplicity of different feet is in describing meter. For example, Robert Pinsky has argued that while dactyls are important in classical verse, English didactic verses uses dactyls very irregularly and can be better described based on patterns or iambs and anapace feet, which he considers natural to the language. Actual rhythm is significantly more complex than the basic scan meter described above, and many scholars have sought to develop systems that would scan such complexity. Vladimir Nabokov noted that overlaid on top of the regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line or verse was a separate pattern of accents resulting from the natural pitch of spoken words, and suggested that the term scud be used to distinguish an unaccented stress from an accented stress. Metrical patterns. Different traditions and genres of poetry tend to use different meters, ranging from the Shakespearean iambic pentameter and the Homeric didactic hexameter to the anapestic tetrameter used in many nursery rhymes. However, a number of variations to the established meter are common, both to provide emphasis or attention to a given foot or line and to avoid boring repetition. For example, the stress in a foot may be inverted. Kyrsa or pause may be added, sometimes in place of a foot or stress, or the final foot of a line may be given a feminine ending to soften it or be replaced by a spondee to emphasize it and create a hard stop. Some patterns, such as iambic pentameter, tend to be fairly regular, while other patterns, such as dactylic hexameter, tend to be highly irregular. Regularity can vary between language. In addition, different patterns often develop distinctively in different languages. So, for example, iambic tetrameter in Russian will generally reflect a regularity in the use of accents to reinforce the meter, which does not occur or occurs to a much lesser extent in English. Some common metrical patterns, with notable examples of poets and poems who use them, include iambic pentameter, John Milton, Paradise Lost, William Shakespeare, Sonnets. Deictic hexameter, Homer, Iliad, Virgil, Aeneid. Iambic tetrameter, Andrew Marvell, to his coy mistress, Alexander Pushkin, Eugene Origin, Robert Frost, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Troctic octometer, Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven. Trochaic tetrameter, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, The Song of Hiawatha, the Finnish national epic. The Kalevala is also a trochaic tetrameter, the natural rhythm of Finnish and Estonian. Alexandrin, Jean Racine, Phèdre. Rhyme, alliteration, and assonance. Rhyme and alliteration and assonance and consonance are ways of creating repetitive patterns of sound. They may be used as independent structural elements in a poem to reinforce rhythmic patterns or as an ornamental element. They can also carry a meaning separate from the repetitive sound patterns created. For example, Chaucer used heavy alliteration to mock Old English verse and to paint a character as archaic. Rhyme consists of identical hard rhyme or similar soft rhyme sounds placed at the ends of lines or at predictable locations within lines, internal rhyme. Languages vary in the richness of their rhyming structures. Italian, for example, has a rich rhyming structure permitting maintenance of a limited set of rhymes throughout a lengthy poem. The richness results from word endings that follow regular forms. English, with its irregular word endings adopted from other languages, is less rich in rhyme. The degree of richness of a language's rhyming structure plays a substantial role in determining what poetic forms are commonly used in that language. Alliteration is the repetition of letters or letter sounds at the beginning of two or more words immediately succeeding each other, or at short intervals, or the recurrence of the same letter in accented parts of words. Alliteration with assonance, I don't know how to say that word, played a key role in structuring early Germanic, North, and Old English forms of poetry. The alliterative patterns of early Germanic poetry interweave meter alliteration as a key part of their structure, so that the metrical patterns determines when the listener expects instances of alliteration to occur. This can be compared to an ornamental use of alliteration in most modern European poetry, where alliterative patterns are not formal or carried through full stanzas. Alliteration is particularly useful in languages with less rich rhyming structures. Assonance, where the use of similar vowel sounds within a word rather than similar sounds at the beginning or end of a word, was widely used in skaldic poetry. It goes back to the Homeric epic, because verbs carry much of the pitch in the English language. Assonance can loosely evoke the tonal elements of Chinese poetry, and so it is useful in translating Chinese poetry. Consonance occurs when a consonant sound is repeated throughout a sentence without putting the sound only at the front of the word. Consonance provokes a more subtle effect than alliteration, and so is less useful as a structural element. Rhyming schemes. Many languages, including modern European languages and Arabic, poets use rhyme and set patterns as structural element for specific poetic forms such as ballads, sonnets, and rhyming couplets. However, the use of structural rhyme is not universal, even with the European tradition. Much modern poetry avoids traditional rhyming schemes. Classical Greek and Latin poetry did not use rhyme. Rhyme entered European poetry in the High Middle Ages, in part under the influence of Arabic languages in Al-Andalus, modern Spain. Arabic language poets used rhyme extensively from the first development of literary Arabic in the 6th century, as in their long rhyming qasidas. Some rhyming schemes have become associated with specific language, culture, or period, while other rhyming schemes have achieved use across languages, cultures, or time periods. Some forms of poetry carry consistent and well-defining rhyming scheme, such as the chant royal or the rubric, or other forms have variable rhyme schemes. Most rhyme schemes are described using letters that correspond to a set of rhymes. So if the first, second, or fourth lines of a quatrain rhyme with each other and the third line do not rhyme, the quatrain is said to have an a-ba rhyme scheme. This AABA rhyme scheme. This rhyme scheme is the one used, for example, in rubric form. Similarly, the ABBA quatrain is what's known as enclosed rhyme, is used in such forms as the Petrarchan sonnet. Some forms of more complicated rhyming schemes have developed names of their own, separate from the A, B, C convention, such as the Ottava rima and the terza rima. The types and use of differing rhyming schemes are discussed further in the main article. Second, just checking. A form in poetry. Poetic form is more flexible in modernist and postmodernist poetry and continues to be less structured than in previous literary eras. Many modern poets eschew recognizable structures of forms and write in free verse. Free verse is, however, not formless, but composed of a series of more subtle, more flexible, prosaic elements. Thus poetry remains, in all its styles, distinguished from prose by form. Some regard for basic formal structures of poetry will be found in all varieties of free verse. However, much such structures may appear to have been ignored. Similarly, in the best poetry written in classic styles, there will be departures from strict form for emphasis or effect. Among major structural elements used in poetry are the line, stanza, or verse paragraph, a larger combination of stanzas or lines such as cantos. Also sometimes used are broader visual presentations of words and calligraphy. These basic units of poetic form are often combined into larger structures called poetic forms or poetic modes. See the following section, as in the sonnet. Lines and stanzas. Poetry is often separated into lines on a page in a process known as lineation. These lines may be based on a number of metrical feet or may emphasize a rhyming pattern at the ends of the lines. Lines may serve other functions, particularly where the poem is not written in a formal metrical pattern. Lines can separate, compare, or contrast thoughts expressed in different units, or can highlight change in tone. See the article on line breaks. Lines of poems are often organized into stanzas, which are denominated by the number of lines included. Thus, a collection of 2 lines is a couplet, or distich, 3 lines a triplet, or tercet, 4 lines a quatrain, and so on. These lines may or may not relate to each other by rhyme or rhythm. For example, a couplet may be 2 lines with identical meters, which rhyme, or 2 lines held together by a common meter alone. Other poems may be organized into verse paragraphs, in which regular rhymes with established rhythms are not used, but the poetic tone is instead established by the collection of rhythms, alliterations, and rhymes established in paragraph form. Many medieval poems were written in verse paragraphs, even where regular rhymes and rhythms were used. In many forms of poetry, stanzas are interlocking, so that the rhyming scheme or other structural elements of one stanza determine those of succeeding stanzas. Examples of such interlocking stanzas include, for example, the ghazal and the villanelle, where a refrain, or in the case of the villanelle, refrains, is established in the first stanza, which then repeats in subsequent stanzas. Related to the use of interlocking stanzas is their use to separate thematic parts of a poem. For example, the strophe, antistrophe, and epode of the ode form are often separated into 1 or more stanzas. In some cases, particularly lengthier formal poetry, such as some forms of epic poetry, stanzas themselves are constructed. according to strict rules and then combined. In skaldic poetry, the dikovekt stanza had 8 lines, each having 3 lifts produced with alliteration or assonance. In addition to 2 or 3 alliterations, the odd-numbered lines had partial rhyme or consonants and dissimilar vowels, not necessarily at the beginning of the word. The even lines contained internal rhyme and set syllables, not necessarily at the end of the word. Each half line had exactly 6 syllables, and each line ended in a trochee. The arrangement of drojovates followed far less rigid rules than the construction of the individual drojovates. Visual presentation. Even before the advent of printing, the visual appearance of poetry often added meaning or depth. Orostic poems conveyed meanings in the initial letters of lines and in letters at one specific places in a poem. In Arabic, Hebrew, and Chinese poetry, the visual representation of finely calligraphed poems had played an important part in the overall effect of many poems. With advent of printing, poets gained greater control over the mass-produced visual presentations of their work. Visual elements have become an important part of the poet's toolbox. And many poets have sought to use visual presentation for a wide range of purposes. Some modernist poets have made the placement of individual lines or groups of lines on the page an integral part of the poem's composition. At times, this complements the poem's rhythm through visual caricatures of various lengths, or creates juxtapositions so as to accentuate meaning, ambiguity, or irony, or simply to create an aesthetically pleasing form. In its most extreme form, this can lead to concrete poetry or azimatic writing. Diction. Poetic diction treats the manner in which language is used and refers not only to the sound, but also to the underlying meaning as its interaction with sound and form. Many languages and poetic forms have very specific poetic dictions, to the point where distinct grammars and dialects are very specifically for poetry. Registers in poetry can range from strict employment of ordinary speech patterns, as favored in much late 20th century prosody, to very highly ornate uses of language, as in medieval and Renaissance poetry. Poetic diction can include rhetorical devices such as simile and metaphor, as well as tones of voice such as irony. Aristotle wrote in the Poetics that the greatest thing by far to be a master of is a metaphor. Since the rise of modernism, some poets have opted for a poetic diction that de-emphasizes rhetorical devices, attempting instead the direct presentation of things and experiences and the exploration of tone. On the other hand, surrealists have pushed the rhetorical devices to their limits, making frequent use of kateris. Allegorical stories are central to the poetic diction of many cultures, and were prominent in the West during classical times, the late Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. Aesop's fables repeatedly rendered in both verse and prose, since first being recorded about 500 BCE, and perhaps the richest single source of allegorical poetry through the ages. Other notable examples include the Roman de la Rose, a 13th century French poem, William Langland's Piers Roman in the 14th century, and Jean La Fontaine's Fables, influenced by Aesop's in the 17th century. Rather than being fully allegorical, however, a poem may contain symbols or allusions that deepen the meaning or effect of its words without constructing a full allegory. Another element in poetic diction can be the use of vivid imagery for effect. The juxtaposition of unexpected or impossible images is, for example, a particularly strong element in surrealist poetry and haiku. Vivid images are often endowed with a symbolism or metaphor. Many poetic dictions use repetitive phrases for effect, either a short phrase such as Homer's rosy-figured dawn, or the wine-dark sea, or a longer refrain. Such repetition can add a somber tone to a poem, or can be laced with irony as the context of the words changes. And that's poetry. I could go on and on. Talk about this all day. There's a lot of more different types of poetry than that. But this is a 25-minute video, so I don't really want to make this an hour-long video, because that'd be a waste of my time. I can only make videos so long, after all. I've got other stuff to do with my day. I'm a very busy man. Let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite type of poetry? Do you have a favorite poet? Let me know what are your opinions about poetry. Let me know in the comments below. Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps the channel out a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.